The palace didn't feel the quake at first, it heard it. A whisper, sharp and cold, sliding under locked doors and polished floors, carrying a single message that made courtiers freeze mid-step. Fergie has spoken. Not loudly, not recklessly, but just enough. And in that quiet confession, something old and buried cracked open, sending panic racing through a world built on silence. Because when Sarah Ferguson finally allowed a truth to surface, it didn't just stir memory, it threatened to redraw the story Meghan believed she had already escaped. This isn't a tale that begins with a duchess or a crown. It begins with a promise made long ago. The promise that certain nights would never be named. Years of loyalty, discretion, and royal habit held that promise in place. Until now. And when that seal broke, it didn't shatter glass, it shifted foundations. To understand why Meghan felt the ground tilt beneath her feet, you have to rewind far past the headlines, past the titles, past the carefully curated versions of who people became. Back to a time when ambition still wore its original face and the palace had no idea who she was. February 2002. Nice, France, not London. Not Hollywood. A coastline bathed in money and secrecy where influence floats as easily as yachts. Prince Andrew was traveling through Europe on official business. That part is public record. What wasn't public was the private celebration arranged in his honor, not in a hotel ballroom or an embassy hall, but aboard a Greek millionaire's yacht anchored just far enough from shore to escape consequence. No cameras, no press. No witnesses who mattered. Only the wealthy, the connected, and the carefully selected. And among them, sources say, was a young American woman with no title and no fame, but an unmistakable certainty about where she was headed. She didn't arrive by accident. She didn't stumble into opportunity. Witnesses describe her as alert, watchful, already performing the role she intended to claim. She spoke of Hollywood and power as if they were appointments, not dreams. She spoke of her background with confidence that demanded belief. This wasn't about partying. It was about timing. Every story that refuses to stay buried has one thing in common: a witness who didn't belong. In this case, a man known only by a pseudonym, not rich, not royal, an outsider who wandered into a night designed to erase itself. He remembers the shift in the air before Andrew arrived. He remembers how attention bent toward one woman who spoke like destiny owed her a seat. When Andrew stepped onto the yacht just after 11, the atmosphere tightened, and she moved. No waiting, no introductions, no pretending not to notice. Within minutes, she placed herself where she could not be ignored. Witnesses say it happened fast, so fast it stunned the other women on board. Less than half an hour later, she was sitting on his lap, in full view, whispering, touching, behaving not like a guest, but like someone who believed she already belonged. And Andrew didn't stop it. That's the moment the story changes shape, because bold moves only succeed when someone allows them to. He stayed seated. He stayed engaged. And when the two of them disappeared down a narrow staircase toward the private cabins, the yacht swallowed them whole. For 3 days, no deck appearances, no mingling. Crew members later recalled meals delivered to a single cabin, morning to night, night to morning, a door that stayed closed. And whatever happened inside was never meant to surface. No photos, no recordings, only memory and the kind of silence that grows heavier with time. When they finally re-emerged, witnesses say she looked calm, satisfied. And then she said something that froze the room: "I've got my prince at last." That wasn't flirtation. That wasn't a joke. It was a declaration. They left the yacht together without explanation, as if vanishing for 72 hours required none. But consequences don't need explanations to begin. And once the yacht drifted back into anonymity, the aftermath followed her onto land. She didn't behave like someone who'd had a fling. She behaved like someone who believed a future had been secured. Sources say she kept in touch with people from that night. More importantly, she tried to keep in touch with Andrew. At first, communication existed. Then, London reclaimed him and the line went dead. Calls unanswered, messages swallowed. Silence that hardened into a wall. According to sources, staff were instructed not to put her through. That wasn't confusion, it was finality. But here's the detail that turns tension into danger. She wasn't calling for nostalgia. She wasn't calling for closure. She believed she had news. News she thought would force a response. News that would make silence impossible. The phone never rang back. Days passed. Then weeks. And what began as certainty curdled into panic. Because silence, when you're holding a secret, is pressure. Sources say she believed she was pregnant. Not wondering, believing. In her mind, this wasn't crisis, it was leverage. Permanence. A future snapping into place. But London stayed quiet. And when powerful men choose silence, they leave others to carry the weight. Sources say she waited as long as she could, hoping the door would open. It didn't. And alone with a decision she never expected to make, she chose termination. Not because ambition faded, but because protection never arrived. If the story ended there, it would have vanished quietly. It didn't. What followed wasn't emotional fallout. It was physical, and it would alter everything. Sources say she pivoted, attaching herself to new circles of influence, repeating patterns that felt familiar. Then came an encounter that spiraled beyond control. A severe infection, a medical emergency, and a surgery that closed the door on biological motherhood forever. This wasn't elective. This was survival. And this is why that chapter stayed locked. Because it traces a line back to the yacht, to those 3 days no one wanted examined. Ghosts don't disappear because people stop naming them. Years passed. Andrew never spoke, but Sarah Ferguson remembered. The keeper of history. The woman who knew his patterns, his shadows, his truths. She carried knowledge without weaponizing it until now. When Fergie finally allowed recognition to surface, she didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She acknowledged. And that was enough. Enough to connect past to present. Enough to make Meghan feel the story she buried pressing toward daylight. The wave has started moving. The thing about old secrets is this. They don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with headlines or sirens. They move quietly like air pressure changing before a storm, and by the time people realize what's happening, the damage is already underway. That's exactly how this one began to surface again. Not as gossip, not as accusation, but as recognition. Inside palace walls, recognition is lethal. Sarah Ferguson didn't step forward as a woman seeking revenge. She didn't posture, didn't dramatize, didn't demand attention. She did something far more dangerous. She acknowledged that history exists whether people approve of it or not. And when she did, it sent a signal to everyone who understood royal subtext this story was never finished. For Meghan, that realization hit like cold water because she had built an entire identity on forward motion, reinvention, progress, new chapters replacing old ones. The belief that once you cross a certain threshold, a marriage, a title, a palace gate, the past loses its claim on you. But the royal world doesn't work like that. It doesn't erase, it archives. And Fergie is an archivist. She lived through Andrew's rise and unraveling. She saw the private behaviors long before the public scandals. She understood how patterns repeat, how silence protects, and how some truths stay buried not because they're false, but because they're inconvenient. For years, she carried that weight without flinching, until the present began echoing the past a little too loudly to ignore. Sources say Fergie's words weren't aimed at Meghan directly. That's what made them so effective. She didn't need to say a name. She didn't need to connect dots publicly. Everyone who needed to understand already did. And that's how panic spreads, not through exposure, but through implication. Because implication invites questions, and questions are what the palace fears most. Behind closed doors, people began revisiting timelines, re-examining overlaps, asking themselves whether the story they'd accepted was complete or merely convenient. And once that door cracked open, Meghan's carefully curated rise started to feel less airtight than before. Not because of proof, because of possibility. That's the part people underestimate. In royal culture, possibility alone is corrosive. It doesn't need confirmation to destabilize, it just needs room. And suddenly, there was room. Imagine Meghan standing in corridors lined with portraits, faces frozen in authority, survival, scandal, endurance. Royals who outlasted disgrace by controlling narrative, not by escaping truth. She entered that world believing she could outrun her earlier chapters, that a new surname, a new role, a new audience would drown out everything that came before. But history doesn't drown easily. It waits. And now, according to sources, she feels it stirring. Not as tabloid noise that she knows how to manage, but as something colder, something institutional. Because when figures like Fergie speak, they don't speak to the public first. They speak to the system. And this system listens. Whispers have already begun about what comes next. A book, a reflection, a reckoning framed as survival rather than revenge. Fergie has always positioned herself as someone who endured the royal machine rather than benefited from it. That gives her credibility, and credibility is power. Power Meghan understands very well. That's why sources said the fear isn't about what's already been said, it's about what hasn't, about the chapters Fergie still holds, the context she hasn't shared, the connection she hasn't spelled out. Because once a single truth is acknowledged, it legitimizes the rest, and legitimacy is the one thing secrets cannot survive. The palace now sits in a familiar posture, waiting, holding breath, measuring risk. calculating whether silence still serves or whether preemptive control is necessary. This is the same posture it adopted before other scandals broke wide open. The calm before narrative collapse. Meghan knows this posture. She's seen it before, just from the other side. The difference now is that she's inside the institution she once challenged. And institutions don't protect outsiders the way they protect their own unless the outsider becomes essential. That calculation is still ongoing. What makes this moment especially volatile is timing. The royal family is already strained. Trust is thin. Public patience thinner. There's little appetite for surprises and even less tolerance for stories that suggest old mistakes weren't learned from. Which means this isn't just about Meghan's past. It's about Andrew's. About who knew what and when. About how many times the palace chose containment over confrontation. Fergie's acknowledgement doesn't just point backward, it points inward. And once that happens, everyone gets nervous. Meghan built her public image on transparency, on reclaiming narrative, on telling her truth before others could define it. But this is one chapter she never told. Not because she forgot it, because it didn't fit the arc she needed the world to see. Now, the arc is bending. The storm hasn't broken yet. There are no official statements, no denials, no confirmations, just pressure building, quietly, steadily. The kind of pressure that cracks glass without making a sound. Sources say Meghan feels it, not as fear of exposure, but as loss of control. Because the most dangerous stories aren't the ones told loudly. They're the ones other people decide to tell for you. And Sarah Ferguson has survived too much to speak carelessly now. If this story continues moving toward daylight, it won't do so in chaos. It will unfold methodically, wrapped in memory, framed as history, justified as truth long overdue. And when it does, it won't just reshape how the public sees Meghan's rise. It will force a reckoning with the idea that nothing, not titles, not palaces, not reinvention, ever fully escapes its origin. The rain hasn't started yet, but the sky is heavy. And Meghan knows that once the first drop hits the glass, pretending not to hear it will no longer be an option. It will no longer be an option. It will no longer be an option. It will